Don't know if you can hear me or not. There we go. Think you can hear me now. All right, please open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, that's where we've been. That's where we'll be. We're planning to be for a little while. So Matthew chapter 5. Last time, Scott has covered verses 17 through 20. And he has done such a good job that he made comments about me trying to edit and change, but I have nothing to edit or change. So unless you have any questions, as always, the email that you can direct those questions to is scott.abernathy. So we are about to start a newer section of the Sermon on the Mount. We kind of poured the foundation with the Beatitudes, where Jesus describes the character of the people of God, and then we have the next section, which describes how that character is going to influence the world, the salt and the light. And then Jesus a little bit shifts gears, if you will, there in the section that we covered last time. And here it seems like he kind of shifts gear a little bit again as he begins this section, which is going to be the rest of chapter 5. So following the 7-section outline that we gave on the introductory class, this would be the part called the Christian's righteousness, which goes from verse 21 to the end of the chapter in chapter 5, verse 48. There are 6 different sections in these verses, and we aim to cover each section in a different class. So the next 6 classes are going to be the rest of chapter 5, or at least that's the plan. However, before we get into what these verses actually say, let's focus a little bit on what Jesus is doing. So there is no consistent way to describe what Jesus is doing here. It seems like it's one of those things that it depends who you ask. And the first thing that is suggested is Jesus is giving a new law which takes the place of the law of Moses. And you can see how he's basically talking about, you heard that it was said, but I say to you, which is also probably one of the things that would have maybe struck people listening that day as somebody that was speaking with authority, because generally the religious leaders would not necessarily say, this is what I say. It would be more of what we do ourselves, where we would quote, and we do quote passages because we have the Word of God. So this is something different that Jesus does when he says, I say to you this. And so it is suggested that here Jesus is basically giving a refreshed version, or a law 2.0, if you will. Another thing that we see here in these verses is that potentially Jesus is actually exposing the religious leaders' attempts to restrict the law and or to find loopholes around obeying the law. So Jesus is saying, this is what the law says, and this is what you've been trying to do, and then he just basically explains. So, for example, in the passage that we are going to cover at least part of tonight, we have in verse 21 where Jesus says, you have heard that the ancients were told, and in the following 5 statements he generally uses a similar formula. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you, that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. And then sometimes Jesus adds a little bit of commentary. For example, verses 23 to 26, where he just says, therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. And then he uses another example in verse 25 and 26. So generally the structure here is, you heard that it was said, but I say to you, and then sometimes Jesus adds a little bit of a commentary, of an explanation. He expounds on his point. And so he's just either he's giving a new law. You heard it was said, this is what you were told up until now, but I say to you. Or he's just exposing what the religious leaders would have been doing with trying to find restrictions to the law or loopholes to go around the law, which we'll get to eventually to the passage that we just read. Or is Jesus bringing everyone back to the heart of the law? Is Jesus maybe here trying to get the people back to where God would have wanted the people to be to begin with? Scott used the illustration of what the law was supposed to do, and I'm going to use my own illustration. I don't know, you're probably going to be more confused about what the law was supposed to do after all these illustrations, but I thought Scott had a good one, and he had been using this kind of other illustration, which I'm about to present before, so I don't know, maybe it'll work for others as well. But you know, when you have a small child, a son, a daughter, or a grandchild, and they are just about the age when they start to walk, and our children walk way too early, so they didn't do as much of that. But sometimes they'll have a little walker or a little thing with wheels that they'll hold on to, and they'll just walk with it, you know, kind of along, holding on, and they push the whatever support they have, or they are in that walker thing that, you know, make sure that they don't fall and hurt themselves. So that's kind of what the law was doing. It was helping you learn, and it was, you know, a support, a tutor, like it says, like Paul says. But it was kind of like a support. And then once you have the new law, if you will, once you know to walk, then you don't need that support anymore, because now you have you have the ability to walk. So we have the law of Christ. So we don't have a need for a support anymore, for a guide. We have the law of Christ. So is that what Jesus was doing? Is Jesus trying to get the people back to what God meant the law to be, just to be a support to help guide people to do what God expected, but not just the mechanically doing what God expected? You know, the mechanical description of what we are doing here right now is there is a number of human bodies semi-resting in a position, listening to words being pronounced in a large room. Or there is a body of Christ listening to God being presented. You know, which one do you like best? So there is just the mechanical description of what is going on, and then there is a more, I guess, hopefully heartfelt description of what is going on. So is maybe Jesus trying to get the people to move from the mechanical side of just doing what they were told to do what they were supposed to be doing with the purpose that God intended? Or maybe a combination of bullet points 2 and 3. Maybe Jesus is addressing what the religious leaders were doing with the law, and at the same time is bringing them back to what they should have been doing all along, and especially why they should have been doing it in a certain way all along. One of the things that is interesting to me is to see in a passage like 1 Samuel, and we used 1 Samuel before in our introductory class, but if you go to 1 Samuel chapter 13, after, if you will, a early big failure of King Saul, in 1 Samuel chapter 13, when Saul had disobeyed to the commandment of Samuel, and then Samuel comes to him, and he basically reprimands Saul in verse 13, 1 Samuel 13, in verse 13, Samuel said to Saul, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever." You remember at this point Saul had offered that sacrifice without waiting for Samuel to come. Verse 14, but now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. And the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. So Saul has disobeyed. He's not obeyed. He's not kept what the Lord had commanded him. But because of that, because of the lack of obedience of Saul, then God has picked a man after his own heart. Somebody that has the heart after God. And then we go to chapter 15. Other failure of Saul. Chapter 15 in verses 22 and 23. 1 Samuel 15:22. Samuel said again to Saul, has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. So now, the problem is, well, obedience to do what God wants, the way God wanted it to be done, is better than just doing what you think God would expect. And then we go the next chapter, in 1 Samuel chapter 16, when actually Samuel is sent to anoint the next king that God had talked about in the first passage we read in chapter 13. Samuel is sent to the family of David, and he sees all the brothers of David, and he starts to make up his mind, if you will, about how, well, okay, this is going to be the king, about one of the brothers of David. So in verse 6, 1 Samuel 16 in verse 6, when they entered, all the brothers of David, he looked at Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. You know, he looks like a king. He's got to be the one that God sent me for. But in verse 7, the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him, for God sees not as man sees, for a man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So we see that even back with the Old Testament, when things were a lot more mechanical, when you were told to do certain things in a certain way, there is still God looking at the heart. God looking at doing the right things in the right way and not just doing them. So we have these different things that Jesus may be doing in chapter 5. But surely we can see how in the Old Testament, how the law was also meant to help the people of God to be behaving in a certain way because of a purpose, because of who they were, because of who they served, rather than just doing things just because they were told to. Kind of like, you know, your child cleaning the room, and yeah, you know how it goes. You told your children before. You were told as a child when your parent came to the door and said, you got to clean your room. Which, as a child, it sounded like, hey, you're having too much fun right now. I got to do something to disrupt your enjoyment so that I'm going to make you do this thing that is the least pleasant thing that you can think of right now. Is that what it sounded like? So, sometimes when we obey because we have to, not because we want to. And so it seems like Jesus is trying to help people understand that obey because you want to, not because you have to. And you don't try to, obedience because you have to is the obedience that you're not willing to do everything it takes. You're not going to spend 4 hours cleaning your room. You're going to stick something under your bed, throw stuff in the closet, pile up something in the corner, and 15 minutes at most, everything is done because you didn't want to do it in the first place. And so obedience because we have to is going to lead us to trying to find loopholes, to trying to find a way to do the least I can just to pass, rather than to do what God expects truly. However, we spent about 10 minutes of class talking about what Jesus is doing. However, let's focus really on what Jesus is saying, because that's what is applicable to us. And in the end, it doesn't really change much as to what Jesus was doing at that point in time when we try to apply that to ourselves, to apply those words to ourselves. So here, at least, I don't know if you see it, if you've been reading as we plan to read the Sermon on the Mount once a week. I don't know if you've been reading, but if you have, and I don't know if you noticed or if you think like me, and I know it would be scary to think that you would think like me, but I see a progression here in verses 21 to 48. These 6 sections, in these 6 sections, Jesus is addressing different items, but it seems like he's moving from a starting place to an ending place. It starts with the passage that we read about murder. You heard the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. So that's the first section that he addresses. And then, and we'll go back here in just a moment to that topic, but then he moves to verse 27, where he talks about adultery. Adultery, kind of like, the taking what is not yours, what does not really belong to you, what is not really something you should have access to begin with. So we move on from taking life to taking something that you have no access to, you have no right to. And so he discusses that part. And then he moves to divorce, the getting rid of something that you are bound to, that you have no right to get rid of. And so it seems like it's growing in that progression as well. And then you have a passage about character, and I tried to find one word for each, and some of these were easier than others, but the passage about character, about what you vow and how you vow and what kind of person you are when you make those vows. And then from there, it talks about retribution, where he says in verse 38, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And you know how that worked if you ever had a sibling growing up. They punch me, I'm going to punch them plus 10%, right? An eye for an eye plus 10%, a tooth for a tooth plus 10%. That's usually how we measure, just so that we are sure that we pay back, right? And so Jesus says, well, you heard about this thing, how it was just equal retribution, but now I'm going to tell you a different way. And so if somebody sues you for something, give them more. If somebody forces you to walk 1 mile, walk 2 with them. And then this all culminates in love. Don't love whoever just loves you. Love especially those that don't necessarily love you. You heard it was said in verse 43, it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, which actually a passage that Steve used in the lesson, I believe, last Sunday before. So there's this progression that goes from murder to love. And as I was trying to find a way to describe this kind of love that Jesus talks about, I thought, sincere love, true love, and then I decided love, period. Because if it's not sincere, it's not really love. If it's not true, it's not really love. So once you say love, in the context of what God is and what God expects, it's love, period. There's no qualifier to add to it. It's just love. And that's what God is and what God expects. They're just that pure, and I'm qualifying, but it's just love. The way that love is meant to be. The way that love is described by Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 and in many other passages. The way that love is in God sending His Son to die for people that don't deserve that. Are there any questions, comments, rebukes? Yes, sir.
Just thinking about the passage that Jesus said at the end of Matthew 22, all of the law and the prophets hung on love the Lord your God with all your heart and labor at yourself. Something you mentioned earlier about you were looking for that.
Yes, sir.
The importance of, God has always wanted us to do the right thing for the right reason.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Mr. Ciotta was quoting Matthew 22. I believe his verses, it's kind of like towards the end of the chapter. Matthew 22 in verse 37, when the scribe, or the lawyer, I guess, goes to him in verse 35. One of them, a lawyer, Matthew 22:35. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." Which actually is similar to a passage that we have been and we will be building up towards, which is what we call the golden rule in Matthew 7, verse 12, where Jesus says, "In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets." So we see how the goal, the purpose is that. Any other comments? All right, questions? Okay. Yes, sir. That's fine. Hey, at least somebody's talking.
At the end of Matthew 4, verse 23, it references Jesus going about teaching the gospel of the kingdom. Now, a lot of times, Jesus would be, you might say, preparing people for things that would be a part of his kingdom law, like we think of the Lord's Supper,
Mm-hmm.
6, or how to deal with a brother who sins against us, Matthew 18, or even the new birth of John 3. There were things that he would introduce to people in this gospel of the kingdom.
Yeah, so what Mr. Ciotti is saying, looking even back at right before the text of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 4:23, Jesus is introducing, I guess laying the groundwork for some of the things that people that will follow him from then on would be doing. And so that's, I assume, Mr. Ciotti, I guess you're saying that part of what he's saying in the verses in the Sermon on the Mount is also part of this is what you're expected to do, or what I expect you to do.
I believe so, but just in general, that verse 23, Jesus did that kind of thing. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that is what's going on in Matthew 5.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Anybody else? Yes, sir. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and Mr. Cook is saying, how, I guess this is such a big responsibility in a way of how we are to behave, I guess. Is that kind of a good way to summarize? Did I do justice to it? I was just thinking when you were saying that, because we mentioned the golden rule, and really this is what Jesus is building up towards. If he just showed up and said, he just quoted the golden rule, do to others what you like them to do to you, and then left, okay, so what is it that we are supposed to do? What is it that I like done to myself? And so we wouldn't have that standard that Mr. Cook was referencing in his comment if we didn't know what we are supposed to be and what we're supposed to do. And so the golden rule is I guess, much more valid based on all the explanation that Jesus has been doing on character, on behavior, on standards, and realizing, as Mr. Cook said, that once we were still sinners, Jesus died for us. So it's that kind of character where, sometimes we think we have to be owed something before we do something for somebody, but it's really, we are taking the initiative to do that first. Anybody else? Did I see another hand? Okay, so in Matthew 5, back to Matthew 5, in verse 21, Jesus quotes, obviously, one of the commandments that would have been very familiar to the people listening to him, though that's kind of where the familiarity stops, because all the teaching of Jesus to this point, and even from this point, is very revolutionary based on what the people at that time, with their knowledge, that on that side of the cross would have been expecting, would have been used to. Even just, if you used to go, quote unquote, to church back then, the kind of sermon you would have been hearing would not have been what Jesus is presenting here. So it's kind of like these people show up at church at the gospel meeting one time. There's the guest speaker they have not heard before, but they heard a lot about, and here the sermon is completely different. And you don't know what to think, in a way. So it would have been new, if nothing else, to the listeners. But as we look at this passage, where it says, he quotes this commandment about you shall not murder. What is murder? We kind of briefly mention what murder is. We're looking at that series of passages. But what is murder? What do you do when you murder somebody? Okay, you're taking their life. It could be that you're doing more than taking their life. It could be that you're, in a way, taking their eternal life, because it could be that they are not right with God in the moment when they are murdered. So you're taking a life, but in a way you're also, I guess, doing your part in helping them go into a place that you would not want to end up yourself or wish for anybody to end up to. Well, you're also murdering them, so there's a degree of hate there. What else? What else do you think when you think of murder? Taking the life. Selfishness. Okay. What else? Okay. Premeditated hatred. That sounds like a tongue twister. Okay, what else? So it's being some level of hate that has been building up and eventually culminates in getting rid of that person. Murder is, if you will, it's the ultimate separation also, in this life anyway. And the way that I think of murder is everything that God is not. Is that a good summary? Murder is everything that God is not. God is life. Murder is taking life. God is love. Murder is the culmination of hate. Is that a fair description? Anybody? And so that's why, maybe, at least in my mind, that's where God starts. He starts from the point that is describing what God is not. Everything that is the opposite of God, taking life, hating, selfishness. And he builds up all the way, he ends up at the end of that chapter where he's describing everything that God is. Selflessness, giving when people don't deserve it, giving and giving more. So there's this build-up of what Jesus is doing. And I thought it would be interesting to see kind of how the progression of murder takes place. And I thought about Genesis chapter 4, the ad hoc murder example in the scriptures that happens really, really soon. And it has all the perfect murder components. And I'm sorry to say it this way, but it is just such a fitting example of what murder is, because of a brother killing his own brother, because of how he builds up towards it, and because of how it happens. Murder just doesn't happen. That, it could be by accident, manslaughter, I guess, but murder itself just doesn't happen suddenly. It has to be a product of some build-up something, either specifically against a certain person or against, just the build-up that needs to have an outcome, and you're going to murder somebody just because, like I guess happens sometimes. But in Genesis chapter 4, you remember the context that is described here. with Cain and Abel bringing a sacrifice before God. I guess Genesis chapter 4 in verse 3. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions, and the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and for his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. And then we see verses 6 and 7. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry?" And remember that word. Why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. And Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Do you see how God is giving a warning? You know, at this point, Cain didn't have the scriptures to refer to, and he didn't have the word of God, really. However, God is, in a way, showing up, talking to him, something, and he's just saying, you better watch it. Because that anger that you have is going to slip into something bigger, and then into something bigger, and then before you know it, sin is going to take over. Sin is always there and is ready to get you. And then eventually it basically grabs a hold of Cain, and Cain just does this despicable thing where he just kills his brother. So we go back to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, and we see how Jesus says, you heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder. And whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. So we see how Jesus is saying, hey, you have heard this. And actually, when we talk about you have heard, how many people back then had the Bible app on their smartphone? Nobody. How many people had smartphones back then? How many people had at least a written Old Testament in their bookshelf at home? You know, just about nobody. How many people could read? Very few. And sometimes we don't give these people enough credit, but these people would have had all their Bible knowledge in their mind. And they would have been hearing it taught, most of these anyway. Obviously, the scribes and the religious leaders would have had more access to it. But if you were just the common Lorenzo back then, all the Bible you had access to was probably what you heard other teaching you. And so you heard that it was said. It's also maybe referring to the oral, but also to the way that the oral teaching was done, because people wouldn't just necessarily go home and sit and read their Bible or pull up their Bible app while waiting at the doctor or something. And so here Jesus again is kind of changing gears to where, well, it says, do not murder, but I say to you, everyone who is angry, remember that word from Genesis 4? Your anger is going to end up in a really bad place, Cain. Whoever is angry, says here in verse 22, whoever is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into fiery hell. Very strong words that don't make Jesus popular today. But this is possibly Jesus just saying, hey, you were told to be afraid of the consequences of murder because, hey, murder these days is at least 15 years, right? Or I guess 12 if you have a good lawyer. However, don't be concerned as much about what the sentence would be at the courthouse as much as you'll be concerned with what God thinks. And not only that, you should be concerned of what God thinks of what you have in your heart before even that murder comes about. Nobody here, I suppose, have ever, killed anybody, even though, God forgives. So, but I assume most people here have felt the righteous kind of anger before. So while you don't get to be at the courthouse with the judge saying, I'm going to, put you in jail for however much time, before God, we are all guilty. And I know we stopped much earlier than letting that anger slip into something bigger, and then into something bigger, and then into, hatred, and into actually acting. But before God, we're all guilty. The word that Jesus uses here is the word for court, and then it's basically, you be liable for judgment. But then he also uses the word, at least in my translation, and I mean your translation may say something different, where he says in verse 22, if you say to your brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. Does anybody have any different word there in verse 22? I'm looking for a specific word that would be familiar to us, especially in the latter time of Jesus' life. Council? Yeah, Sanhedrin. That would be the council of the elders, or especially the Sanhedrin. So that's where Jesus would have been, when he's basically sentenced. So that's something that the people back then would have been familiar with. And again, it's not the physical consequence of a physical act. Is how you're going to have to face God about what your heart was like before all that came about. In 1 John chapter 3, I think John does a much better job than I do at tying that together. And I should have gone there 10 minutes ago. 1 John chapter 3 in verse 15, again, very direct words. 1 John 3:15, everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. Very simple, very direct. It doesn't take a specific action to be liable before God. It's, it's not when the river gets to the sea that is the problem, is the spring when the river is born. That's the problem. It's when that feeling begins, not when it culminates into an action. So, any comments, questions? Comments? Any comments? All right. Back to Matthew chapter 5. So, again, even in the passage there, that's the first bell. Even in the passage that we read from John, there's a specific description of what somebody is like, what somebody risks when they have this kind of disposition. There's a specific verse that I thought would help bring all this together, and that's found in actually in John chapter 8, which I should have had you go there before going back to Matthew 5. But in John chapter 8, when Jesus is having one of his many, arguments or debates with some of the people that come to him to criticize him, in John chapter 8, in verse 44, Jesus just says to them, you are of your father the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning. It does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie. He speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. He is a murderer. He is the opposite of what God is. And so we look at this, and when we have anything that leads to the ultimate action that Jesus described, is not God, is of the devil. Any final comments or ways that you can I know Scott will fix it a week from Sunday. Yes, sir.
Hebrews 4 describes our heart. Everything about us being laid open before the eyes of Him. We have to do. Just thinking from Matthew 5 here about what we think, what we say, especially what you and I, Christians, will be judged by.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that's a good thought. In Hebrews 4, everything is open before God. He can see everything, even though I cannot see what you think right now. God can, and God can see what I think, and God can see what I do whenever nobody's watching, and so that's another reason why we need to be careful. All right, I appreciate your good attention, and we'll keep going on Sunday, Lord willing.
Well, good evening. Well, judging by what this weekend is, maybe I should say good evening. In the past year and a half, that's just the beginning. The past year and a half, circumstances not only affecting me but others as well have led me kind of living from one place to another. And I won't go into detail of all that, but it's led me to ponder the question, what is home? Because none of the places, as blessed and as thankful as I am to have had the places, none of them have felt like home, not at least not permanent home. So I want to ask the question, what is home? When we think of home, common phrases come to mind. Maybe home is what you make it, or where I lay my head is home, or the most common, home is where the heart is. Whatever view of home you have, it will probably share similar qualities. Place of rest, maybe even rejuvenation. There's a familiarity there where you're not stressed out and you let your guard down. You can let your guard down because you trust the surroundings. Maybe comfort, where you can relax and unwind completely. Maybe that's what home is for you, and I know a lot of parents are maybe rolling their eyes at me for that one. But it's a place where you feel welcomed. Home is a place where you put roots down. It's a place that, like I said, you feel safe. When you return from being a long way away, you're always driving towards home. You're looking forward to home, to being home. Now, a lot of these qualities could be shared with or maybe attached to other things in your life or around you, but a few of the things, maybe friends, family, the church. You could attribute those qualities of home maybe to those different things. But now we ask the question, are any of those things reliable for stability, for the stability of a home? All of those things, every one of those things can change. They're constantly changing. One day it's fine. Another day you're not friends anymore, or you're not family anymore, or maybe the church is not united anymore. Big disagreements, tragedies plague every one of those and can change in any of those things in an instant. It can cause division. So then you're left looking for a new home. You're left seeking out places, new places or people where you belong with or belong to. But the problem is you're still depending on things here. You're still depending on people and places. And each one of those things can change. You find yourself wandering. You find yourself wandering, looking for some kind of stability, but you're ultimately looking in what is sinking sand. A few years ago, some friends and I went to, there's a cave between here and Scottsboro called the Tumbling Rock Cave. And there was a section where we crawled up pretty tight, but then if you turned right, there was a sign. It was a cliff, just darkness, just pure darkness. And there was a sign up and a rope. It said, "Warning, do not cross this rope because the sands are constantly shifting." Now, naturally, I had to kind of reach over just to test it. But now, what I found out was you could even hear it. You could hear the sands kind of going down, falling. And what I found was I didn't have to put any pressure on that at all for anything to sink in. I couldn't, let alone stand firm on that if I placed all my weight on it. Now, you also comes to mind the idea of sands on a beach, where we just, with Lydia's family, we went to the beach this past week. And there's a canal there where the water in the high tide would come up and fill that area, but then during the day, the tide would recede. And every day, that sand was a different design or different structure, or however you want to say that. It changed from day to day, and changed very drastically sometimes. But you get the idea. People change every day. So you can't rely on that. There's no stability there. Now, another thing that I've learned, or one of the biggest things that I've learned in the last year of moving, is constantly picking up and going to another place is exhausting, right? There's stress and uncertainty involved in all of that, and you kind of feel like you're being tossed to and fro, maybe to go back to the ocean or beach metaphor. But when you find a place, a new place to rest, you grab hold of it, you snatch it up, but knowing in the back of your mind that's not going to last forever. But for now, you're good. What do they say? Any port in the storm, right? Whereas any chance for immediate comfort, you take it, you grab it. And there's a lot of people that treat drugs and other substances maybe that way, where they offer a bit of comfort in the moment, and then they get hooked onto that. People treat ideologies that way, where they're up to whatever feels good to them or feels right to them in the moment. We can be desperate enough to take anything when it comes to us. So we're wandering from home or a comfort, from one home or comfort to another. Now let's take a moment to examine this earth, this planet. We're broadening our horizon a little bit. We ask the question, can we depend on it? Can we rely on it for stability? Can we put all our trust in it? Genesis 1:1, we all know, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. But then at the end of that chapter, after it lists everything and all the days that he created a new thing, everything was deemed good. Up to that point, everything was, and he saw that it was good after he created it. But then everything was completed. And in verse 31, God saw that all he had made, and behold, it was very good. So there's no denying that there is a beautiful design to it, and that it's ultimately blessed by the designer, by God. However, can we put all our hope and trust in it? A lot of earth is dangerous. Actually, most of earth, when you think about it, is a very dangerous place. And one of my favorite moments when we were at the beach was there was one night that I went out of the hotel and walked out the beach alone. I like to do that and kind of take it all in. It's a very soothing place. Well, I get down to the water edge, put my feet in the water, and you get the waves coming in, and you feel, it was surprisingly not that cold, but you feel the water. And you make contact with the water. When you think about it, I stood there, and I was somewhat terrified. Now, that's kind of an interesting thing to say under the circumstances and where I was, as beautiful as it was. But I became terrified because I was making contact. I was being connected with this large is an understatement, large body of water that covers most of the earth. Not only is it huge, but it's been here since the beginning of time, since God made it. So it's ancient. I'm connected with this big thing. Now, without technology or special equipment, we can't see under the surface of that massive thing. We don't know what's swimming around underneath. We don't know how big, whatever that is, or where it is. So there's a lot of things that are kind of unnerving. And when you think about the ocean as well, you have these vast caverns, vast sections of the ocean's floor that we haven't even touched. After all this time, we still have not mapped out everything down there. We don't know what all is down there. And I get back up to the surface. I hear the waves crashing and churning, on the shore. But then in the distance, on the horizon, you can tell there's clouds, and there's lightning. There's a storm. It's far away. I wasn't in it. But you can see it, and you can see these explosions of lightning, explosions of light off in the distance. I couldn't even hear it, but I could see it going off. And that in itself is energy, massive energy reaction really being released. And very deadly if you're caught in it. But again, it's by water in the form of clouds at this point. So I look at all that, and then I look up. It's clear. I don't have any clouds overhead, and I can see the stars, hundreds of stars. I can see a bright moon, and I start to feel kind of at peace. But then you think about it. Higher up you go, the less air it is, the more dangerous it gets. Then you go beyond that, beyond our atmosphere. You go into the stars. All there is death. It's cold, it's silent, but it's death. There's nothing that can survive out there. Now, what protects us from that? And that goes on forever. It's constantly expanding. But what protects us from that? Well, it's a thin layer, comparatively. It's a thin layer of a bubble wrapped around that we can survive underneath. But like I said, comparatively, that's a pretty thin layer protecting us from all of that death. A few weeks ago, I like to keep up with the kind of space things that go on. A lot of you probably heard the civilian, I guess it's the second civilian launch to take these people up in space. And I think it's only for 11 minutes. But on that crew was William Shatner. Now, to me and a lot of other people, that's Captain Kirk, right? And there's a lot of things that people were focusing on around that and his age and who he was and going to space. Well, I was more interested in what he had to say that day. Before the flight, he said, "I've heard about space for a long time. I'm taking the opportunity to see it for myself." What a miracle. You can almost hear kind of the excitement and the anticipation in that. But then, an hour later, after they came back down, listen to what he said after they landed. His tone and excitement significantly dropped. Very somber now. He goes, "I hope I never recover from this. I hope that I can maintain what I feel now. I don't want to lose it. It has to do with the enormity and the suddenness of life and death. It's unbelievable. The moment you see the vulnerability of everything, it's so small. This air in which is keeping us alive is thinner than your skin. And then to see the blue color of the atmosphere shoot by like that. Down there is comfort. But then you look up there, it's death. It's magnificent, but it's death." Truth is, this world wants us to die. That's not me being pessimistic. That's just the nature of life. At the end of everybody's life is death. It's a natural part of it. Death will nourish something else and keep it going. Lion King even made a song about it, and I won't sing it for you. But that's the circle of life. Everything depends on something else dying to nourish another, to sustain that. And even in Eden, and we weren't made to live forever. Even in Eden, we had to survive on the eternal food provided by God if we wanted to live forever. It had to have been from Him. But our natural bodies were made to die. This world needs us to die. That's its goal. And the threat that's held over us, held over our heads by the actual ruler of this world. C.S. Lewis describes life on earth as us living behind enemy lines. And I really like that because it reminds us that this is Satan's territory. We all live and die in Satan's territory. Now I ask you, after all that, where is any comfort? Is there any comfort in any of that? I don't think so. So then where can we find home or comfort? We'll have to look beyond our friends. We have to look beyond our family, beyond our planet, beyond our space. We have to look to another realm completely for comfort. Everything that offers life is found in God, in heaven, the true home. He invites us to live and live forever. Now, when I was thinking about this lesson, one of the interesting connections I made was the idea of home is not too dissimilar from the idea of truth. You have comfort in truth, some modicum of comfort where you're not having to guess and you're not having to hope, but you know, well, that's what it is. So there's comfort in that. There's something you can rest on. You can find healing in some cases from truth. Maybe not at first, but eventually healing will come. And it makes you feel at ease. So then, the natural question is, what is truth? I'm talking to an audience that probably knows where I'm going with this, but what is truth? Truth is reality. It's a matter of fact. The truth is, this is a microphone. That's the truth. And it doesn't change. Look outside, and that seems to be the extent of reality. To us, I can touch it. I can smell it. I can taste it. I can see it. I can hear it. So all five senses agree that's real. But to reiterate, as real as that is, it's changing. It's constantly shifting. Malachi chapter 3, verse 5. For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. So we see here God is truth. God is constant. He is immovable. He is everlasting. So what is the Word of God? Well, you go to John 1 and verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things that were made through him, and without him was not made anything that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I like that phrase and how he puts it there, has not overcome it. The darkness has not overcome it. It's not the darkness did not overcome it. That would be in the past. Has not is happening now. It still has not overcome the light. So it's always true. Now in verse 14 of that same chapter, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Christ. Christ is the Word. Christ is truth. What does Christ say? Mark 16:16. He who has believed and is baptized shall be saved, but he who has disbelieved shall be condemned. A lot of people want to take when the disciples, when they talk about baptism being absolute truth, a lot of people want to take that because they were man and maybe bend it a little bit or change it to where maybe I don't need baptism. And then you may be telling yourself, but my Bible has that in brackets, so it may not have been there originally. So then I throw this one, John 3:5. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. So I thank you for patiently sitting here. Hopefully you've been listening. Hopefully I have something to offer you. But to sum everything up, my friends are not truth. My family is not truth. My church and my preacher are not truth. Now, don't get me wrong, Steve. We should be following, both of those should be following truth. But that's not what I hang my hat on. That's not what I make my roots on. My thoughts and my feelings are not truth. My past is not truth. This world is not my truth. Truth is God. Truth is his word. Truth is Christ. Truth is found outside of our world. It's not dependent on anything that happens out there or in here or in here. Now, if you're ready to declare any of that, it's time to stand for truth. It's time to come home or come back home to God through Christ in baptism. If there's anything we can do for you, please come forward as we sing.